Are going to let folks make their way in from the waiting room, and we will get started in just a moment. All right, my friends, welcome. I hope everyone had a wonderful, restful, and restorative August. We missed you, and we are so excited to be back in the Lunch and Learn game here in September. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for today's program. Tidal and river hydrokinetics role in the clean energy transition. And thanks to everybody who is watching this recording on YouTube. Ocean Renewable Power Company is a global leader in marine hydrokinetic technologies that harness the power of river and tidal currents into predictable electricity without the use of dams or impoundments. ORPC is based in Portland and is operating a tidal energy project in Eastport and a river hydrokinetic project in Millinocket. We are so excited to learn more and are grateful to welcome ORPC's Vice President of Development, Nathan Johnson. Thanks for joining us today, Nathan.
Thank you.
My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore Maine's environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. A few notes before we dive into today's program. We're going to hear from Nathan first and tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them, synthesize those with similar themes, and ask as many as possible following the presentation. We ask that you not message speakers directly, as we want their focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can reach out directly to Maggie Summers and she will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where we have a number of playlists to help you focus in on particular topics. Thank you again for joining us. And Nathan, I will turn things over to you.
Terrific. Thank you all. Thanks to MCV for the invite and interest. We're certainly really excited to present today. Let me bring up the screen. And certainly appreciate everybody taking the time on a Friday afternoon and kind of the first week and last week of summer, it seems like, in Maine here. But really appreciate you taking the time. So let me see here. All right, so hopefully folks can see the first slide here. I'm going to be talking about really a focus on a lot of our recent initiatives and our efforts in Maine. This photo actually is from several months ago of a device that we deployed in Eastport, Maine, our next generation tidal system. So I'll be going through a lot on kind of where we've been and where we're going, and certainly look forward to the question and answer session as well. So real briefly on myself, I'm a Mainer. I grew up on one of the islands in Casco Bay. I continue to live there with my family, where we've been for many, many generations. I have a degree in geology from Tufts University, and following that have been involved with a lot of aspects of different development work, from construction management to groundwater development with an engineering firm prior to ORPC. And then I've been with ORPC roughly 12 years, leading our development team. And we as a company will get into that a little bit more, develop both the technology, but insertion points for that technology. So it's always exciting work. I do continue kind of family heritage around the commercial fishing industry as well. Both my father and my children are still in the lobster and fishing industry, as well as being kind of a leader in the new kelp aquaculture industry. That's been really kind of fascinating as well. And because of those skill sets, I serve on a number of boards, including the advisory committee to Maine Sea Grant, the Island Institute, and the Maine Fishermen's Forum. So more on ORPC, we've actually been around since 2004. We're headquartered right in Portland, Maine on the waterfront, which is really an ideal location to be. It's great to be here right in the working waterfront. And our type of work really fits into that, we feel, not only now, but in the future. We've grown fairly rapidly over the last few years. We're up to 41 employees. Roughly 30 of those are in Maine. We also have subsidiaries in Canada, in Ireland, and a partnership down in Chile, which I'll touch on as well. So what we do is we develop technology that produces electricity from the velocity of water. So that could be tides, rivers, ocean currents, and convert that to electricity. And we feel that there's a unique nature in the renewables world from that type of energy and additional value. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And then trying to package that, so ultimately we give a solution to our customers in the communities we work with. We do focus very much on working with communities and creating local economic development opportunities. That's been a huge part of our success, and I think is reflected in a number of projects that we work with. Over the years, we've actually, starting in Maine with a deployment of our first tidal system in 2012, our first large tidal system in the Eastport, Lubec area. We've really worked on refining our turbine technology, and that's the technology. It's one, we call it a cross-flow turbine. It has foils that generate lift with the water and rotate given the velocity. The higher the velocity, the faster it rotates, and the more power it produces. And so over the years, we've been really able to refine what we call our turbine generator unit and then modify that for different market opportunities. The first of which is the RibGen power system, and I'll get into a little bit more detail, but we've been operating devices in a remote community in Alaska the last few years with that system. We now have a device deployed in Manitoba, Canada, and are in the process of shipping a device to Chile later this year for deployment in Patagonia. That same turbine system we've modified for other applications, for integration with infrastructure in places where there is more access to deployment vessels and deployment infrastructure. We call it a modular RibGen. It also incorporates elements to kind of increase the performance and be modular and stackable. And then the same turbine systems we've been incorporating into our next generation tidal devices, which we call TideGen. We are working on larger scale devices as well, primarily out of our European operations, and I'll touch on that as well as we continue to grow. I mentioned the community of Igiugig, Alaska. It's really been a fascinating partnership. We have really enjoyed working with this community. The photo on the upper right is actually two of our RibGen devices on the surface before they're submerged. This was taken just a few weeks ago. We now have two devices there and are in the process of commissioning the complete power system for that community. They're an incredible native community that for millennium have really relied on the river and what it produces, both from a cultural and a subsistence perspective, but also it's a commercial fishery that runs to Bristol Bay. So there's a lot of importance around the sensitivity around the resource. And we've done a lot of work to characterize environmental interactions, ice interactions, and working with the community. And the first device we deployed ended up being kind of the longest duration deployment of a hydrokinetic device. And as I mentioned, now we're kind of working on those next systems and the full system for deployment for the community. This is just to give a little bit feel for what these systems look like. The velocity of the water turns the turbines. There's a perception that they turn very fast. They actually don't turn that fast. The rotations per minute is about 60, so 1 rotation per second. This is in a flow of a little bit greater than 2 meters per second, which is fairly fast flow. That's the type of velocity that we look for to drive those turbines. And those turbines turn a generator, which is on the right-hand side of the device, the yellow unit. And that sends electricity to a power station at shore, which goes into a microgrid. In the case of Igiagig, they use diesel for all their electricity production. So it results in very high cost of power. They actually have to fly in their diesel for those systems. And so having a system in the river that operates 24 hours a day, year-round, really allows them to regulate those diesel generators to backup only. And so that has very positive effects on the community from an environmental, from a social perspective. And it's been a great partnership. And so we've taken that model and are looking to replicate that model for remote communities around the world, many of which are on diesel for power generation, which results in very high cost and environmental and social concerns, but also other communities that are on the grid that benefit from a predictable source of renewable energy in terms of resilience. Based on the success in Igiagig and our other deployments, we've really been focusing on scaling up and taking a global approach. Over the last few years, we've had inbound interest from over 50 countries. This figure actually shows kind of various ranges of engagement. There's actually 700 million people in the world that are on diesel for power generation, and another 1 billion that don't have access to electricity at all. So it's a large market, and as we continue to grow and bring down our cost, other markets open up as well. So this year we're focused on the 2 devices in Igiagig, Alaska. We have another device, as I mentioned, in Manitoba and Canada. We have 2 modular rigged devices in Millinocket. I'll touch on that. We have our single turbine version of our Tidal that's been deployed in Maine. And then the 2 upcoming ones are a turbine that we'll be testing in Rome, Italy in October, as well as the deployment in Patagonia. In regards to our main efforts, which is certainly the focus of this audience, we have a fairly large footprint in the state of Maine. I mentioned our efforts in Eastport and Lubec previously. We are working with the city of Eastport and have for a number of years to really advance the tidal energy testing in that area and ultimately towards a project that contributes to their resilience and grid, in partnership with the national labs, the local utility, which is Versant, and other partners, including the Allen Institute. And then more recently in Millinocket, we've been working with Katahdin at the One North site, which is the redevelopment of the former Great Northern Mill site, and we're really excited about that partnership. In addition to those active project locations, we have for a number of years been partnering with the University of Maine, particularly the School of Marine Sciences, around some of the environmental monitoring that we've done in the Eastport Lubec area. I mentioned Versant Power already. We do have a location at Tech Place in Brunswick, where we do a lot of testing of generators and microgrids and other components that has really been beneficial before we put devices out in the field. And then we're headquartered in Portland, as I mentioned before. A little bit more on our activities in Eastport recently. This is a photo on the left of a single turbine version of our Tidal system that we deployed in late May of this year. A lot of this is done with local contractors. This is actually at the Eastport Port Authority, where we deployed the device and towed it out to the deployment location in Cobswick Bay, where we previously tested. This is a short-term test that is intended to really take lessons learned and incorporate them into a 4-turbine system that we call Tidal 80 on the right. And our intent is to deploy that system in 2024. We're really excited to get back in the water in Eastport. It's been a few years since we've had a device there. and really take this testing in partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy and in advance of building out a project that contributes to the city's reliance or resilience, I should say. And on that note, we've been working with the city and other partners under a Department of Energy funded program called ETIP, Energy Transition Initiative Partnership Project. It's a competitive process where communities can apply to the ETIP program. And if they're successful, they get support from the national labs and other partners. In Maine, it happens to be the Island Institute is the key partner that is involved as well. And for us, it's been the city of Eastport and Versant as the other partners. And this has really allowed the city to take a look at how do they incorporate tidal energy into the future planning of their grid. Eastport, even though it's not an island, it was once an island. It's connected by a causeway, and they're kind of at the end of the line, the electrical grid, and so that results in some potential for vulnerabilities to storms and other outages. So putting together local generation, predictable generation with tidal energy, coupled with battery storage and solar, I'll touch on that in a little bit, is really a big advantage and something that we're excited about. And then in Millinocket, I mentioned previously, the photo on the right is the site. Mount Katahdin is in the background there. The site is adjacent to the former Great Northern Paper Mill, which was at one time the largest paper mill in the world. That mill is gone, and we've been working with Katahdin to look. We feel that our technologies, they were very interested in our technologies because they fit into their innovation and technology focus of redeveloping the site. So they're looking at a number of different technologies, a number of different initiatives. We feel that this site is actually a terrific site to test. It's very accessible. It's within the state of Maine. It kind of came to us during COVID, which was a big advantage given some limitations on travel. And it's been a really great partnership. And so what we've been able to do is deploy a single device there back earlier this year, and then couple the second modular RivGen device to it later this spring, and operate the two devices simultaneously. This is a video that I'm going to play that goes into some more details on the technology. It's actually, this video was produced and published on YouTube by the Department of Energy about a month ago. And in addition to the technology itself, it gets into some of the use cases that we're looking at for the technology. Whereas the RivGen is really optimized with a delivery system for remote communities where there aren't much equipment. This is really looking at for integration with existing infrastructure, but also end uses like EV charging, critical infrastructure like water, wastewater facilities, defense facilities, or other existing work. So I'm going to play this video, and hopefully this goes smoothly.
Next to a redeveloped historic paper mill in Millinocket, Maine, ORPC is deploying a next-generation river hydrokinetic power system called Modular RivGen. This device, developed in part with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office, is designed to generate emission-free electricity from river and tidal currents into existing critical infrastructure.
We believe this is a real opportunity to scale our business rapidly and also be a point of excitement for our industry.
Hydrokinetic devices like the Modular RivGen convert the energy of tidal, river, and ocean currents into electricity. These devices have the potential to provide millions of Americans with locally sourced, clean, and reliable energy.
It really demonstrates what smaller systems, kilowatt systems, can do. The modularity that you can actually put two systems side by side or one on top of each other is really impactful, because you can be in smaller stream environments and be able to generate kilowatt power that could sit there and provide onshore power to a facility or to a microgrid.
The Millinocket stream, where ORPC has deployed these devices, is about 100 feet wide. Two Modular RivGen devices are connected horizontally and anchored about 1.5 feet under the water's surface. Buoys mark these devices' locations so people using the stream for recreation will know exactly where they are. The deployment of this device demonstrates a partnership between ORPC and Katahdin, a nonprofit organization that manages One North, a 1,400-acre renewable energy hub for the development and manufacturing of sustainable products. Once both modular RibGen devices were installed, ORPC began gathering data to characterize device performance and inform future testing at the site of advanced components, systems, and use cases.
When a lot of people discuss renewables, they talk about wind or solar or nuclear or geothermal. There's a huge untapped resources out there from moving water that's highly predictable. So you think about tidal energy, there's nothing more predictable than the tides. And so knowing how much electricity you're going to have every hour and minute of the day can really help support the grids in the future.
WPTO, with awardees like ORPC, will continue to harness predictable sources of energy to bring power to existing critical infrastructure across the U.S. For more information about hydrokinetic devices and more, visit energy.gov/water.
And to kind of wrap up modular RibGen and Millinocket, I wanted to note that just over the last few weeks, these projects actually present opportunities for other research and development around them. So we've actually hosted the University of Washington 2 weeks ago. They have a team that has a system for characterizing the acoustic signature of devices underwater. So they use hydrophones, drifting hydrophones, and they spent a week in Millinocket 2 weeks ago doing that. They're definitely one of the industry leaders on the research side. And then on the right is a photo of just last week, where we were working with the Department of Energy's National Laboratory in Sandia National Laboratory, which is located in New Mexico, to do hydrodynamic measurements around the devices to understand velocities and wakes and ultimately performance of the devices. So there's a lot of add-on opportunities for research around this, and we certainly have demonstrated that with the University of Maine as well as other partners. So it's an exciting project that we're very it's going to be operating for probably the next 6 months. And I mentioned that this is a terrific site. We hope to continue testing various devices and components there in the future. So next steps, and I'll be fairly brief in terms of time here, so we can leave plenty of time for Q&A. I mentioned before eSport, and this kind of captures some of the thought process and the concepts on developing out a smart microgrid in the eSport area, with tidal energy really as the base to that generation. So we're working with Versant Power, we're working with the city and other partners to really define what this looks like with smart controls to provide a solution that's will benefit the community, ultimately end up in more resilient grid and lower cost in collaboration with the Allen Institute, looking at other energy efficiency initiatives as well. So excited about this. This is something that's going to unfold over the next year or so, and then will be a multi-year project to build out. We're looking at locations. I mentioned before Copsic Bay. That's actually on the southwest side of eSport. On this figure, you'll see numbers 3 and 4. Those are actually locations in Western Passage, which is on the border with New Brunswick, where we intend on putting devices for integration into the grid. I mentioned previously as well our efforts in southern Chile, in Patagonia. This is the location, which is pretty amazing. I haven't had the opportunity to be down there, but others have within the company. A community called Chile Chico. Many of the communities in Patagonia use diesel for power generation. Some of them are very large communities. Their grid ends about 2/3 down the country, and so they're really looking similar to the communities in Alaska or northern Canada, looking for alternatives, and certainly in a pristine location like this, the other forms of renewables or large hydropower are not the right solution. So we feel like we have a really great fit there, and are excited about sending our first device down there later this year for deployment early next year. And then in addition to the remote communities, we're looking at other locations where we can really scale our devices. And modular RibGen is a type of technology we think would be suitable for this. So this is an example of some of the work that we've done to characterize the river resources around the U.S., with a highlight on the state of Louisiana. The Mississippi River runs through Louisiana. It's a tremendous resource. There's a number of different use cases that can be demonstrated with different end users in the region, and we're really excited about exploring this further. So one example of those is we have been working with Shell to look at the viability of our devices at their facilities on the Mississippi River in Louisiana. So we've looked at 3 of their facilities. We sent a team down in April to do measurements on the Mississippi River to characterize the velocity and depths, and then are working with other stakeholders in the region and Shell to look at end applications for that power, to really look at industrial decarbonization, development of alternative fuel production, or other uses. So another example of kind of what we're doing here in Maine is expanding to other larger markets. And within that vein, I mentioned previously that we are developing through kind of our European operations larger scale devices, megawatt scale devices. This is primarily done out of our colleagues in Ireland, but with funding from the Republic of Ireland as well as the European Union. And so we are in the earlier stages of developing a large single turbine device that we call Optimor. And we've done some subscale testing at the University College Cork, which is in Southwest Ireland, and are working with other universities, including the University of Galway, on integrating fiber optics into our turbine systems so that we can, foil systems actually, so that we can monitor long-term health. And all those things are being tested in a tank in Rome, Italy in October. So it's a subscale phase approach to larger devices. We hope to actually deploy our first device in the region in open water environment early next year as well. So we're progressing and we're excited about that. And those larger devices we think are applicable to larger tidal resources in Europe, in places like the Bay of Fundy, and certainly in Cook Inlet in Alaska as well. So lots to look forward there, lots of opportunities, and it all comes back to Maine and the efforts we're doing here. And so with that, that's the end of my slides, and I look forward to any questions folks may have.
Well, Nathan, you're in luck because we have a ton of good questions. But first, I just want to say thank you so much. Oh my goodness. We have done a lot of programs about different forms of renewable energy over time, and folks are always saying, what about tidal energy? So thank you for telling us all about tidal energy and how we can harness that. We have a ton of good questions, but I do want to just let everybody know that later this afternoon, you will get a follow-up email with a link to this video or to the recording of this program, as well as the link to that video that Nathan shared. So if you want to go right to that clip, you'll be able to find that through the afternoon email. You'll also find links to follow ORPC on social media. That's the best way to stay up to date with some of the really cool developments that are going on. I'm going to start diving into questions right now. You should all feel free to continue sending questions to me through the chat, and let's see what we can find out. Let's start with where these projects are being built. It sounds like some communities have reached out to you. Are you also using natural resource databases to screen for potential sites, or wandering around and saying, wow, that looks like an impressive tidal shift? How do you figure it out?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really a combination of both. There have been resource characterization efforts on behalf of various entities in the US. One of the first ones with Tidal was by an entity called EPRI, which is the Electric Power Research Institute. Back in the early 2000s, did an assessment of regions across the US, including in Maine, with a potential for tidal energy. And that spurred some of the initial site development around the US. I would say it's kind of macro scale. So really trying to understand site-specific opportunities is something that we take in in-house and really develop capabilities for identifying those locations. I showed the one map there of the United States. We've done a lot of that work ourselves to look at, where's the potential in river resources. And then we have a team that goes out and actually does measurements. So we use equipment called acoustic Doppler current profilers in the river environment. We'll do transects, and that gives you the velocity. And if you tie it back to historical records and gauges and discharge, you can come up with a pretty good feel for what the ultimate energy production will be. In a tidal environment, it's a little bit different. We deploy, we do transects, but we also deploy those same devices for a lunar cycle, which is about a month. And that will give us the ability to look at what those velocities are and then project them out for decades in the future. And so we do that in a lot of different locations, and that will, really helps us refine where those locations are best.
That is so interesting. And I'm curious about whether there are times that data maybe surprises you. We have a comment from someone who said, I've heard that the velocity of the water in the Bay of Fundy is not sufficient for tidal energy. We've all heard about that. It's one of the places where there's the largest tidal shifts. So are there examples like that? Well, fact check me first and then tell me, are there examples where you're like, oh, that's not what I expected the data to say?
Yeah, I mean, that comment actually could be alluding to that some of the velocities there are so high that they've resulted in some failures of other technologies. So we do try to find the right kind of flow speeds, which tend to be for us between 1.5 and 3.5 meters per second. The velocities in the Bay of Fundy can exceed 5 meters per second in places. So, we look at the locations and the number of sites that have those extreme velocities versus the other ones and the size of the market and where that median market is. We also think we've really taken an incremental approach where, we're not building huge systems. We really like the modular approach, phased approach. Really to demonstrate and de-risk the technology, but also there's a huge stakeholder and regulatory element to this as well. So working with those stakeholders to build confidence in the technology, in the environmental interactions, in the interactions with other marine users or aquatic users is super important. So that's something that we spend a lot of time on, and I think that incremental approach has benefited us as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's almost like you're looking for the sweet spot right now, and that sweet spot might get bigger or
That's
might
right.
change over time. So let's talk about that. How much with that modular approach, how much of the river width, for example, are you looking to cover with the device?
Yeah, it's not so much where we have a prescribed area. What we would look at is what's the need of the community or the end user? What's the velocity of the river? The higher the velocity, the more energy it's going to produce. And then what's appropriate? We wouldn't think it would be appropriate, probably most rivers or tidal environments, to completely cover the cross section with turbines, unless it's an industrial site per se. And so those are all factors that we would consider. There are other technologies in the space that are on the surface, others that are on the seabed. We think there's advantages of being in the midwater column because it allows for existing navigation or floating debris to go over the device, and is up off the bottom where there could be mobile sediments or negatively buoyant debris. And so we think that kind of middle water column has its advantages as well. So those are all factors that we consider.
That makes sense. And then I'm guessing that, and again, fact check me, that also gives some flexibility with the impacts for other users, including fish. Tell us a little bit about any impacts that you've noted on migratory fish in Maine and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, and that's probably the number one question we get asked is about marine life or aquatic life interaction. So I mentioned the University of Maine's been a terrific partner in that. Any new technology, and it's a new technology, a new industry, there's lots of questions. And so the regulatory agencies and stakeholders often ask that question and are really looking to try to quantify that risk. And in these environments, they're very rigorous underwater energetic environments. It's very difficult to even collect data to try to quantify that risk. So the University of Maine has been a great partner where they've actually had to develop technologies and methodologies to monitor. In the Maine, in the tidal environment, we use hydroacoustics primarily, which are kind of like the fish finders you find on a boat, to look at biomass around and in the vicinity of the turbines. But they also did netting studies to try to speciate those fish as well. What they found is the larger fish tend to sense the device, go around it. The smaller fish tend to go right through it without any adverse effects. And we think those minimal effects are for a couple of reasons. One is where we site the turbines in the water column, which gets back to kind of that mid water column. That's an area where you avoid some of the benthic fish or the fish near the surface. But also just the design of the system. I showed the video with, it's a relatively slow rotation. We don't call them blades, we call them foils, because they're actually, there's negative connotations to blades in the first place, but when it comes to fish, but they actually have a blunt leading edge and are shaped like an airplane wing to create lift. So, and there's a lot of open space. So when you take those factors into consideration, the risk is really low. And in the village of Igiugig, Alaska, it was continues to be an incredible location to collect data around fish. It's the highest concentration of sockeye salmon in North America, perhaps the world. And so there's tens of millions of hundreds of millions of small to the small juvenile salmon that come out of the lake and go past this stretch of river. And then there's tens of millions of adult salmon that come up the river as well. Because it's a shallow, clear water environment, we actually could use video cameras there and worked with the University of Alaska Fairbanks on that system. And we're able to really kind of look at some of the interactions because of where the turbine is sited. It minimizes the interactions in general. The adults go up the banks in the slower water, and the juveniles are in the top 1 meter. So that naturally avoids a lot of the interaction. The interactions we did see, none indicated any injury or mortality. So we have a pretty robust data set between our various deployments and doesn't mean there's zero risk, but we feel pretty confident that the risk is extremely low.
I'm always impressed by the amount of homework that you've done. I mean, this is really interesting. Thank you so much. And I wonder about, so other things that you're tracking, like what else are you looking at when you want to say, we want to make this work the best and have the least amount of negative impacts? Are there other things? You said fish are the biggest question you get. What's the next question?
Well, on the environmental side, we do get questions around marine mammals. And so that's kind of both an interaction and a noise question. And so the work that we're doing in Millinocket, for example, to characterize the noise, we've done that in the tidal environment in Maine as well. And the noise of our devices is actually quieter than the ambient noise in the environment. So we'll continue to do that. The University of Maine has actually done what's called passive acoustic monitoring as well to detect vocalization of marine mammals in the Western Passage area to get an idea of what species is present and how frequently are they present. So we do get questions about marine mammals and we have done some effort around that. Certainly the other question we get is cost, and we get that a lot. And so any new technology starts out expensive, and we really have a program to reduce costs through entering markets and scaling and increasing performance, looking at lower cost components. The modular rib gen technology is intended to do a lot of that. We think that, as we continue to scale, we'll be on par with a lot of other former renewables by the 20th unit or say, and we're very quickly on a track to do that. But it's also part of looking at remote communities that have very high existing cost of power where we are competitive today. We can provide a lower cost solution and a more environmentally, certainly a much more environmentally sensitive friendly solution than what they have. In Igiagig, I mentioned, all the salmon. It's so important from a cultural and a subsistence perspective. But they fly it in over the river and they store it next to the river, and then it's burned for electricity. So there's noise and emissions, and the cost of power results where we pay 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour here in Maine. They're paying upwards of $1 a kilowatt hour. So it's very prohibitive, and that is certainly something that that we feel good about, both from a technology but also from a social perspective.
Absolutely, and that's a great sort of comparative note on how this technology compares to some of the other renewable energy technologies that are out there. Can you also give us the context of energy production? So how much, for example, in the Eastport project, how much of Eastport's energy is that? I can't remember. Rivergen? How much is that?
Those will be Tidal devices. So I think it was noted in the video there in Millinocket, most of our devices are kind of on the kilowatt scale versus the megawatt scale. It is dependent on the flow speed. The faster the flow, the more the output. So we kind of characterize our RivGen device at a 40 kilowatt unit at 2.25 meters per second. Now that goes up to 80 kilowatts at 3.5 meters per second, and it's certainly less below 2.25. In the case of Igiagig, 2 RivGen devices will more or less power the whole community of 70 people. So it's roughly equivalent in Eastport in terms of the number of people. So we're looking at multiple Tidal devices, which are bigger systems than the RivGens, and ultimately the megawatt scale devices. We have a power purchase agreement that was through the Maine PUC and with Versant Power for up to 5 megawatts in Eastport. So the load in Eastport, I believe, is 1 to 2 megawatts. So that's just to give you some perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's a good transition too, because the next sort of group of questions are about how that power is getting from the river, the tidal area to the grid. So you've responded to RFPs from the PUC, you've gotten those contracts. How have you faced any interconnection challenges getting the power on the grid? We've heard about that with solar installations, for example, and just wonder if that's been an issue for you as well.
Yeah, it's when we initially secured the power purchase agreement was in 2012, and at that time we did work with what was then Bangor Hydro, which became Emera Maine, which is now Versant, and I think it was even though I wasn't directly involved in those negotiations, I think it was pretty straightforward. What we're aware of now is certainly with a number of other renewable interconnection agreements, solar being one of them, that queue is much longer, right? So it just is a lengthier process to get into the queue and work with, and that's why we've initiated that process for our project in Eastport. Previously, when we had the test project in Cobsec Bay, we actually connected to the grid in Lubec. As we develop a Western Passage site, that will be connected on the Eastport side.
And you mentioned there have been a couple of utility transitions during the life of that contract or that power purchase agreement. But you said Versant has, for the most part, been a good partner in this. Is that
Yeah, they're a great partner. We're jointly with other partners looking at different funding opportunities and how to engineer the complete system where tidal energy is a component of it. So yeah, we've got a very good working relationship with folks at Versant.
That's great. And did you also see you have a relationship with Shell?
We are working with Shell as well, specifically on opportunities. Actually, opportunities in the lower Mississippi, but also on a couple different initiatives in Europe right now as well.
And we've seen some news that they've scaled back their renewable energy investments, but that hasn't affected your partnership or collaboration, or?
It has not, and I know that is a lot of that has been in kind of the offshore wind space. We again, I think, have a somewhat different value proposition in terms of the ability to provide baseload power and connect to critical infrastructure and other sources. So it doesn't mean things couldn't change in the future, but we haven't seen a direct effect from that.
That's really reassuring. Given the relationship that you have with Versant here, and given the fact that utility ownership is on the minds of Maine people right now, do you see any potential impacts if Maine voters were to authorize the Pine Tree Power Initiative, or is that separate from what you're thinking about right now?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure we've really reflected on that too much. I will say that regardless of the ownership structure, the tidal energy resource is going to always be there, and the need's going to be there in the Eastport area. So I certainly would like to think that regardless of that structure, that there'll still be opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. Talk a little bit about your vision for this. Clearly there are some, there's scaling up to be done, and I would love to hear about what you see as sort of the current challenges to scaling this up. But how far are we going? Are you every river channel in the world? Something less than that? What's the right sort of level of penetration for river and tidal technology?
And that's a great question. I think that this conversation is kind of a microcosm of building awareness. I think is not only for our technologies, but for the marine energy and marine hydrokinetic industry is a huge step forward. And there's a lack of awareness and a lack of recognition that this is even a possibility for power generation. And as a lot of countries or organizations or companies look towards 100% renewables, that's difficult to do without a base load source of power. So is it going to be 100% of the power? Probably not, but it'll be a percentage that allows whoever those entities are to get to 100%. And there's other ways to do that. There's in terms of base loads, there's batteries, there's other forms of energy storage. There's pumped hydro or other forms of hydro that could be considered renewable, but it's difficult to do. So we think that we have a real opportunity there to help that transition to 100% renewable. And then certainly as we scale, bring down costs where it is much easier to put these in a lot of different places, including lower flow environments, but also work towards a general awareness that these devices can get in the water quicker. It takes time now. The process is lengthy, and I think as there's more awareness and more acceptance of the low risk, then things will move quicker.
And is that the length of that process, is that about permitting, or is it about the community? I really appreciated your comments about community engagement and stakeholder work. What is it, just a cumulative piece, or?
Well, they're kind of parallel tracks. Certainly in communities, it takes time to build trust and confidence, and especially in remote communities, or native communities where, that trust has been broken by many others in the past. So, that takes time, and I think that's something we really do focus quite a bit on. From a regulatory perspective, it's a bit of a, these are different technologies. So on a federal level, we're regulated under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which has jurisdiction over traditional hydropower. And so some of the elements of what we have to go through the licensing process are really much more applicable to large hydropower, which has much different impacts than our technologies do. So we're constantly working with resource agencies, with FERC and others. We actually have terrific relationships. We share information. We work through and kind of have pioneered an adaptive management approach to collecting data and making decisions with regulators on that data and other stakeholders. But it does take time. And so, again, as there's more awareness, as more devices get in the water, I think that will shorten for sure.
And certainly permitting reform is very much on our minds and in the news, and thinking about how to keep the pieces that are really important, like those, like the community engagement, tribal consultation, but also be expeditious in how we get these projects operational. I imagine you'll be involved in that process in one way or another.
It's part of the puzzle for sure.
What do you think that environmental advocates can do, should be doing to support tidal energy here in Maine, or hydrokinetic energy in Maine, or nationally? Do you have a to-do list for us?
Well, I think it does come back to that awareness first, right? So being aware that this is a solution, and learning more about the solution, and we're very open, and we're happy to share information and articulate that. So learning about where the opportunities that are suitable for this technology are, I think that's really, having advocates, local advocates around Maine has been a huge part of our success, and certainly advocates around the world at this point, and growing kind of that advocacy on this type of solution and the value that it presents in that energy transition, I think is important.
Well, you've got a lot of folks who know a lot more. At least I know a lot more than I did about an hour ago. So thank you. Are there any states that have added a specific line for hydrokinetic power to their RPS goals? Or would it fall under like the broader hydro goal, which, as you said, is similar but very different?
That's a good question. It's pretty varied, actually. I think Maine's done a very good job. It was kind of initiated under the Baldacci administration, where they had the Ocean Energy Act and process that led to the opportunity for a power purchase agreement. I think the state of Maine's been very proactive and supportive across administrations, actually, of tidal energy. There are other states. I mean, not every state has the potential for hydrokinetics. But when you look at both the river and tidal, certainly in tidal, New England, the Pacific Northwest, and Alaska are the states that have the highest potential for tidal energy. There is some interest in ocean current technologies off Florida. And then there's also typically gets characterized in the same space as tidal energy, as wave energy. There are companies that are working at harnessing the movement of waves to produce electricity. That's primarily off the West Coast, but there are companies, and I know the University of Maine is involved in testing some of those technologies in their lab. So there is some local efforts in that space. But those are primarily West Coast opportunities in the U.S. I think that various states are doing various things. One of the things that state of Maine has done was they established an MOU with FERC very early on in the process that established the Maine Department of Environmental Protection as the lead agency in permitting tidal energy projects. And that really kind of brought together the different entities that we were already working with into what I refer to as the adaptive management approach and team. So we work with Maine DP as the lead, and they've been terrific. Maine Department of Marine Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, various divisions within NOAA, their protected species program, their essential fish habitat program, as well as the marine mammals. And I may be leaving a few more others out, but those are the typical ones, both on a federal and a state level, that we work with. And Maine's been terrific. They've been very supportive of that approach.
That's so good to hear. And just, you mentioned wave energy, the distinction there, that's surface level as opposed to the mid-water column, is that
primarily?
Okay.
Primarily, there's a very wide range of different technologies in the wave space, and most of them use that up and down motion of the waves to generate electricity. Not quite as predictable as tidal or river in the right location, but still another really interesting form of generation.
It's so interesting to think about the way that all of these things come together, and just seeing it or hearing about it in real time, that we're not looking for one technology to replace fossil fuel infrastructure, right? It really is a combination of renewable sources. And do you see, you mentioned storage, what's the relationship between hydrokinetic energy and storage, or is there less of a need for it because it's so predictable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of yes and yes. So there is a need. There's some really interesting studies, primarily coming out of Europe, that when you develop a renewable microgrid, you need less storage if you have a predictable form of energy generation like tidal or river. We do use some batteries in our Igiagi project to kind of smooth out the grid. In tidal energy, it's really interesting because with the ebb and flood of the tide, you'll be generating power on the flood or the ebb, and then the tide changes. And so there's kind of a short period of time where you're not generating, a couple hours. And so the existing energy storage, battery storage technologies actually couple very well with that. Whereas solar or wind, you could go several days without generating. So it's another advantage of this type of technology because it's so predictable, and it actually couples very well, and does allow you overall to reduce that amount of storage that's needed for a microgrid.
I keep thinking I'm going to say one final question, but I really am going to have to let you go at some point. So one final question. What's the anticipated lifespan of these devices, and do you do that maintenance? Is there regular maintenance? Is it a set it and forget it?
Yeah,
I can't even ask you one final question in your one final question. There are several.
We design our systems for 20-year life. Right now, that because they're newer systems, we're doing kind of annual inspection and maintenance, but we're looking at kind of a 5-year maintenance cycle ultimately. And that's really important, especially in remote communities. We want to be able to set it and forget it, because it's difficult to get to, and we don't want to have to bring in equipment. So that's really kind of built into the design of the robustness and durability of the systems.
Nathan, I am so grateful to you for sharing all of this work, and grateful to Ocean Renewable Power Company for doing this work. It is fascinating. As I said, I know a lot more than I did an hour ago, and I can tell from the terrific comments and questions that everybody on the call agrees. So thank you for being with us today. Thanks to everybody who joined. You will be getting a follow-up email later this afternoon. If we didn't get to one of your questions and you are just dying to know, respond to that email. We'll track Nathan down. We've got his contact information, and we'll make sure we get an answer to you. So thank you all so much. we are back in our routine of lunch and learns, but that doesn't mean that I remember what's happening next week. So give me just a second. Actually, you know what? You'll get an email and the link to register, whatever we're talking about. Hope to see you there. Thanks so much and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.